Yes, it's time now for the big question in which we tackle a major news story of the day. Tonight, as Tory party conference kicks off in Birmingham, we have a simple question. Can Liz Truss bounce back? To debate this, I'm delighted to welcome former Conservative Minister Anne Widdecombe, the co-founder of Vote Leave and ex-Conservative and UKIP MP, Douglas Carswell, and journalist and commentator and former advisor to Boris Johnson, Tim Montgomery. Tim, let me start with you. Can Liz Truss bounce back?
She can, Mark, if she first of all hires you as her speechwriter. I think your argument for the measures that she made, just over a week ago was one of the best that I've heard. But she's not making that argument, really. The interviews that she gave on BBC local radio last week, after she disappeared for 6 days, she was saying, talking about the energy price cap and trying to pretend that what had caused the turbulence in the markets was her intervention to cap the energy prices that were facing people. What people cannot stand with politicians, and this is the one area where I disagreed with what you said, was if they aren't straight with people. You've got Douglas Carswell and Anne Widdecombe on with me tonight. Those are two straight-talking politicians. They're politicians that people admire for that reason. Liz Truss hasn't been straight with people up until now. She hasn't really made the case for what she's doing. She's hidden in all sorts of convoluted ways behind the energy price cap. If she makes the intellectual case for what she's doing, she has a chance. I think it's uphill struggle now, but she has a chance.
And Anne Widdecombe, she's between a rock and a hard place, isn't she? Because if she scraps the 45p tax cut, well, then she'll win favour with some of her backbenchers and the country and the press. But on the other hand, she's done a U-turn. What do you think she should do?
Favours from any of those groups by reversing anything. If she goes into reverse on any of these measures, then the Conservative government will look even more chaotic than it already looks, and people will think they don't know what they're doing. So I think it's crucial that she sticks with what she's doing. I also think it's crucial that she explains it properly. Now, I think you did, and you did it very well. But what we lose sight of, amidst all the politics of envy and all the rest of it, what we lose sight of is that those of us, and I class myself in this because I did for years, who draw our salaries from the public purse, that's the teachers, the NHS workers, the politicians, we all draw our money. We don't make a darn penny for the country. What actually makes our economy are the businesses, the risk takers, the exporters, the money makers, and the city, which, as I said last time, brings in scores of billions of pounds annually in taxes. Now, these are the people who actually make the money. And to facilitate that, they need the incentives. And I think you're absolutely right. Europe has still got a banker's bonus cap. We now haven't. Therefore, we're at a competitive advantage. And anybody who says that it's wrong to put Britain at a competitive advantage, frankly, just isn't seeing the bigger picture. Now, where I do think she has gone badly wrong is not in what she did. It is in how she presented it. And she should have gone at that aggressively, not just from the first day, but from the very first minute after that budget. She and the Chancellor should have been out there aggressively saying this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. But they didn't do that, so everybody comes out with the usual propaganda line, you're helping the rich to get richer. You're helping the country to get richer. Wakey, wakey.
Wakey, wakey indeed. Is there any way back for Liz Truss, Douglas Carswell?
I do think she not only can bounce back, I think she will bounce back. And I think there are three reasons why I think Liz Truss supporters should be optimistic. Number one, her analysis of what we need to do is absolutely right. Interest rates need to go up and taxes need to go down. And other countries around the world are going to follow what Britain has done, whether they're forced to do it or do it out of necessity. Her basic approach of lower taxes and essentially higher interest rates is unavoidable. The second reason I think she will bounce back is because I think she speaks the truth. There is something dysfunctional about the country. We've had what you might call ghost growth for many, many years, and it's not really sustainable. It's a conjuring trick created by artificially low interest rates. And I'm afraid that ghost growth needs to be replaced by real growth. The third reason politically why I think she could actually be in a stronger position is paradoxically because expectations are now so low. When the pound doesn't slump to 80 cents in the dollar, or when the cost of gas does begin to come down, I think actually, because expectations are so low, I think actually she will be seen as exceeding them, which I think is always a good thing for a politician.
Do you think that the policies from that mini budget will have time to kick in before the next election, Douglas?
Possibly not, but I can't help noticing that people tend to vote for left-wing lunatic governments when they're feeling rich. When times are tough, you can't afford that, and people vote for Conservatives to fix them. Remember Margaret Thatcher in 1981, a budget that was almost universally condemned by people. People stuck with her because the country had run out of alternatives and because she was someone with a plan. And I think those factors, again, will play to Liz Truss's advantage. The country's not going to be out of this mess in 2 years' time. We may not even be out of this mess in 5 or 10 years' time. But the alternative is to follow the remedies that George Osborne and Gordon Brown and Mark Carney have advocated for. And that's simply going to kick the debt can down the road and cause more problems. So I think if, like Margaret Thatcher, she plays on this idea that there is no alternative. She's going to do things that are unpopular. She's admitted that. But I think if she's honest about that, the country will stick with her.
Yes, Tim, you know the inner workings of the Conservative Party very well, a former advisor to Boris Johnson who didn't need any tips on performance or communication. But the bottom line is this mini budget may have prevented Britain from having a deep recession. A simple message. When do you think Liz Truss will get her act together in terms of getting her point across?
Well, I think she's had a rude awakening. This is probably the worst start for a prime minister in modern history. She has gone from having the goodwill of the British people. The British people are not unreasonable. When there's a new prime minister come in, they want them to succeed. This is a crisis time for the country. They want the country to succeed. And because she has perceived, let's just look at the perception for the moment. We can argue about why she's got into this position. But because she's looked like she's put people's pension and mortgages at risk, she's gone from that sort of fair start to a 33% deficit in the opinion polls. And I think the first thing she needs to do is be more collegiate. I think there's been an attitude that she's displayed where I think she thinks she knows it all. She didn't really. I backed Liz Truss rather than Rishi Sunak, but there are talented people who back Rishi Sunak. She included almost none of them in her cabinet, and she should have done that. She needs to listen more. She can't run an economy and a government as complex as Britain's without listening to all the best advice around her, and she hasn't done that yet.
Interesting email, Anne Widdecombe, from my viewer Richard, who says around 20 million people will have had their mortgages rocket up by hundreds of pounds a month immediately after that mini budget. So how will the UK grow if nobody's got any spare cash to buy anything?
Well, first of all, I don't think we appreciate just how unusual it has been for us to have the very long run that we've had of extremely low inflation, extremely low interest rates. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the 70s when mortgages went up to a 15% interest rate. People forget that. So the very fact that this has happened now doesn't mean that it's going to be sustained as jitters calm and nerves calm. I was only worried at one point because I thought that pension funds were being quite badly affected. But quite honestly, if you look at what's behind that, and I appreciate the general public don't, there was already some pretty risky trading that caused that. So, or that helped to cause that. So the question is, though, from the viewer, if people are having to spend more, as they will, despite all the help on energy and on mortgages, etc., where does the money come from to spend? The answer is that if the economy is growing, then those factors actually improve. And then people do have the money to spend. So the crucial thing is to get the economy moving. And the fact is that if we stuck with the policies, Rishi Sunak's and all the rest of it, those policies that we've now had for years, we will carry on being where we have been for years, which is not getting anywhere. And we should always remember that when Mrs. Thatcher introduced a highly controversial budget, 364 economists signed a letter saying it was a disaster, and it actually kick-started Britain, who had been the sick man of Europe, kick-started us until we were the envy of Europe. And so I would say, let's look at what is happening, give this a chance. Because if, for example, if a business starts to make more money as a result of this, they can afford pay rises for their employees. The employees can afford to buy things. These things are not static. You don't just take one effect and say this is going to completely kibosh the economy, this one effect. Not at all. There are many interacting effects, and that's what your correspondent should understand.
Do you know Liz Truss well, Anne? Because I wanted to ask you whether your judgment is that she's got the personal grit and character to see this through.
I don't know her well. In fact, bluntly, I don't know her at all. And indeed, I'm no longer a member of her party, so I'm not likely to get to know her. From what I've seen so far, she is more than capable of sticking to a course, and that is admirable. But she does have to learn to explain what she is doing. And it is not a sign of weakness to explain what you're doing. It is actually respect, simple respect for those who are worried. Now, the vast majority of the public, not all, the vast majority of the public don't go in for highly detailed economic analysis. They take their opinions from the screaming headlines. And that, I think, is what this government has got to learn to counter. And so far, they're not showing much sign of it.
Douglas Carswell, you're in the United States now as an academic, but you were a Conservative MP before becoming Britain's first and only UKIP MP. If you were one of those Tory backbenchers now, worried about their seat at the next election, what would your emotions be?
I'd be 100% behind Liz Truss. I've known Liz for 20, 25 years. She appointed me as a non-executive of the Department of Trade when she was Trade Minister. She's quietly, in a very unflashy way, very resolute. She has a clear commitment to the free market, a clear understanding, I think, that ghost growth engineered by central bankers creating artificially low interest rates doesn't make us wealthy. What we need is real, authentic growth, real, authentic wealth creation. And that doesn't happen simply by sloshing around yet more credit. What that, in fact, does is it leads to greater social inequality, because it means people with assets, whether it's houses or shares or hedge funds, become super, super, super rich. And ordinary folk like the people I represented in Clacton are left straggling behind. So I actually think she's on the side of the kind of C2 voters who were the core of the Thatcher coalition. And I think in time they will rally to her. And in time people will recognise that she represents a real sea change in this country's fortunes. For the first time since November 1990, I think we have an authentically free market Conservative government in Downing Street.
That was very much, Douglas, the thrust of my big opinion monologue, the first honest and authentic politician we've had in decades. So you would agree with her on policy direction, but has she got the performance chops and the political nous to see this through? Is she a good enough communicator, and is she a smart enough politician?
Look, I spent a great deal of my time in the House of Commons trying to undermine a deeply misguided Tory front bench. But I think as a backbencher on this, you need to get behind Liz Truss. And yes, it's true that the presentation of this was imperfect. Yes, it's true they need help. That's what you're there for in the House of Commons. Rally behind Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. Because let's be clear about this. The alternative to this is a left-wing, ultra-socialist government of Keir Starmer, who incidentally will reform the electoral system, so your seat will be gone forever.
You're shaking your head, Tim Montgomery?
I am, because I don't think the Conservative Party can get behind Liz Truss at the moment, because she's trying to do things You can cut the top rate of tax, of course you can, but you can't cut the top rate of tax at the same time you're cutting people's benefits. That's the sort of political act that frightens people to death. So I do think there needs to be some amendment of the mini budget. There has to be a sense that we're a one nation Conservative Party where we will look after everyone. I agree with what Douglas and Liz have been saying. There may well be some very substantial benefits from cutting the top rate of tax. But if people feel that the Conservative Party is the party of the rich, that's always been toxic. So it's not just a case of backbenchers getting behind what Liz Truss wants. It's also a question of Liz Truss listening to the party, listening to the wisdom of her colleagues, and governing for the whole country. And what we also have to be aware of, Mark, you've talked about her being very honest. There was a very clear manifesto at the last general election. It was the manifesto that won Boris Johnson a majority of nearly 80. It didn't have any talk of a bonfire of workers' rights. It didn't talk about cutting the top rate of tax. There is no mandate for what she is currently doing. So she has to have some sense of understanding where the country is and not taking it in a direction that it has not voted for.
Anne?
Yeah, no, I mean, that, is a nonsense, Tim. You look at the Thatcher manifestos. Now, this was Thatcher, and Thatcher was elected, not a successor, but Thatcher. You look at the manifestos. They didn't foreshadow half of what went on, the massive denationalisation, the huge privatisation programme. You actually look at those manifestos, and certainly the early ones were reasonably tame. But as they got into office and got control, they did things. Now, that is what Liz should be doing. He's been elected by the party, and that is what she should now be doing. And you can point to umpteen governments of both parties doing things that were never in the manifestos. So don't try and tie Liz down just to the manifesto. The only thing you mustn't do is break a clear promise.
Douglas, I'll come to you in just a moment. Do you want to respond to that, Tim? Go on.
Tim said that if Liz Truss wants to govern, she should govern as a one-nation Conservative. Listen, if we carry on with the establishment orthodoxy on energy policy, on net zero, and on ultra-low interest rates, Britain will be a no-nation country. Britain won't be able to even heat itself, let alone have basic day-to-day functionality as a state. So it's critical that these changes are made and made quickly. As for this whole obsession with the 45p rate, listen, let's not be so parochial in the conversation in Britain. I'm talking to you from the United States, where the highest rate of taxation that you pay is not only 37%, which is a good deal lower than 45, it only kicks in if you're earning $500,000 a year. Now, that is the competition. That is where you've got to start thinking about how you create wealth. How are you going to compare to the United States? For years, Britain has looked across the channel at an even more parochial, inward-looking, stagnating bloc. You've got to cast your eyes to the wider world.
Tim?
Well, what I would say to you, Douglas, is a lot of Conservatives, I'm afraid, are very interested in the marginal tax rate that the rich face. What about people on benefits, people on universal credit? They lose 60, 70% of their money when they earn an extra pound. What I want the Conservative Party to be, and I know this is what you and Anne want as well, I know you're compassionate people, but this is not where Liz Truss has been. It's looked like we're worried about the marginal tax rate facing the rich, but not the marginal tax rate facing people at the bottom. And so if you're going to do something, which despite what Anne Widdecombe says, it's not that it wasn't in the manifesto, it's the opposite of what our manifesto said. If you're going to do something as bold as this, you have to take people with you. And that means you do the cuts for the people at the bottom of the pile in tax rates, as well as for people at the top.
The lady should always have the last word. Anne Widdecombe.
Yes. I don't believe that this is a contradiction of the manifesto. And you cannot say that Liz Truss has not helped the poor when we've had the energy cap, when we've had money put into that, when we've had huge expenditure on trying to support people. And there are some governments who would have said, well, this crisis is not of the government's making, and somehow we must get on with it. But Liz hasn't done that. She's actually put a lot of money into helping those who are on extremely straitened means. So I don't think she lacks compassion, but I do think that what she lacks is a decent public relations approach. She really does. Now, I'm not talking about a slick approach. I'm talking about just stopping long enough to explain why you're doing what you're doing.
A deeply absorbing conversation. Thank you for your collective viewpoints. Anne Widdecombe, Tim Montgomery and Douglas Carswell. What's your view? Mark at gbnews.uk. Can Liz Truss bounce back?